Now, probably most voters in Virginia are aware that there is a contentious referendum question on the ballot. Vote yes or no, up or down. And it's all about redistricting, which has spawned a few litigations, mostly state courts, by powerful people in power concerned about their power. But also at least one that had been commenced very quietly in federal court. Some may be more familiar than others about some of the issues that have been raised in the press involving these complex legal questions like constitutionality, apportionment, constitutional vagueness, and failure to follow regulations, procedural due process. However, most are probably most familiar with the partisan appeals pitting Democrats and Republicans, conservatives against liberals, and in an identity politics, especially in the American South. The question of race almost inevitably becomes a dividing issue, as it has indeed in the press. So let's just take a few minutes to discuss a related issue that had been raised in this very, very quiet federal litigation, commenced at the end of February in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, in the city of Alexandria, where even when Virginia's 8th Congressional District had been held by Republicans, they had been losing there almost 3-1, as they had since the last of only 3 Republican mayors had managed to get elected in the 1870s. And that is probably a good starting point to begin to understand an unspoken issue in this referendum question battle, because that election had been during the period of Reconstruction, when the Republican Party had been marketed as the party of emancipation. This was the post-war period, when the city was filled by refugees coming from many places further south, just as immigrants had come into Ellis Island and gone to places like Brooklyn, gone out to Chicago, and other cities and mass there. But this was the post-war period, and the city was policed by an army garrison, with the city governed under martial law from 1868 until 1870. And people have a funny way of not exactly liking being ruled under martial law for whatever reason, with no elections. A very different time indeed from today. Just as the Commonwealth of Virginia was being formally readmitted into the Union, when free elections had finally been restored under the new order, former Confederate soldiers and citizens who had voted for the Ordinance of Secession were disqualified from holding office, and candidates who aspired to public office were required to take an oath swearing allegiance to the United States and the Constitution. Themes that we even find in politics today. And in what would go down in history as one of the city's quietest elections, won by a very, very slim margin, William Berkeley, who had been installed as mayor by the military in 1868, being a Republican, just 3 years after a bitter civil war, was elected by forming a winning coalition with the newly emancipated and grateful slaves who voted Republican, but never to occur again in that city after Mayor Berkeley had resigned just a year after his successful election. And that was the old South of Virginia during Reconstruction, that period portrayed in the movie Birth of a Nation. a state where it had, during slavery, been a crime to educate slaves consigned to servitude, and in the state that had forbidden interracial marital unions until Loving v. Virginia had been decided by the Supreme Court in 1967, just a year before Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis. That was the South that baby boomers actually knew, not just from black and white pictures and newsreels and films from the past, but in living color. In those older days, during the period of segregation, airline travel was a luxury enjoyed only by more affluent people, and most common people, when they traveled, if they had the opportunity to travel, had boarded buses and even trains, which in the South had been, of course, segregated. However, because the peculiar institution of chattel slavery was, by its very definition, rather labor-intensive, this had an impact on the local politics and elections, where basic political math dictates if there are more of us and less of them, we win. Very common theme in the current referendum question debate. Consequently, across the Deep South, pockets of black power arose in places like Atlanta and Memphis, where many blacks had remained, some coming up, like Jesse Jackson's father, as sharecroppers in the South, and sending from there black representatives to the U.S. Congress. But it would not be until 1945 when, in Harlem, north of Central Park and above 125th Street, they would elect their very first black congressman, a preacher and pastor named Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who had inherited the pulpit of his father's church at Abyssinia Baptist Church on Odell Place between Lenox and Malcolm X Boulevard today. But if you were to hop aboard the Amtrak train today in New York City, where David Dinkins was not elected the first black mayor until 1990, around the start of the first Gulf War. 2 years after the first black to be elected as member of the Arlington County Board, you might happen to notice a rather peculiar pattern on your journey traveling south, passing through Newark, New Jersey, the hometown of Cory Booker, where Ken Gibson was elected the first black mayor in 1970, continuing through Trenton, where Reverend S. Howard Woodson would become the first black Speaker of the State Assembly, elected with Jimmy Carter in 1976. Passing through Philadelphia, where Wilson Goode had become the first black mayor, not until 1984. 7 years after Reverend William Gray III, who would become the first black House Majority Whip in Congress, launching a political career from his father's church that he had inherited and replacing Robert Nix, the first black ever elected to Congress in Pennsylvania, and who had, before Reverend Gray, served for 2 decades. All of these had been places where, after slavery, many blacks had settled and had amassed large concentrations, much like immigrants had in many cities across the nation that risen to power, creating essentially political power, more of us and less of them. That's how you win in politics. Just like in the nation's capital, where many fleeing conditions further south during slavery had escaped to during the war with the Confederacy and had grown to such a mass that many still refer to this place as Chocolate City, where persons like Marion Barry, Walter Fauntleroy, Reverend, and Eleanor Holmes Norton had been elected. However, back in the days of segregation, if you happened to be a person of color, you had been asked to leave the railway car to continue on to places further south, like Alexandria, just across the Potomac, to ride in the railway car for the colored people. And even today, while even if they have yet to receive statehood with a voting member of Congress, there is a distinct difference in representation in Congress between D.C., which is 43.2% black and 60% minority, and Virginia's 8th congressional district, which is 48% minority. One reason may be that while 8 in 10 residents aged 25 and older in Arlington, the most educated municipality in Virginia, hold at least a 4-year college degree, only 1 in 10 colored folks can say the same. And if their hopes of running for Congress were not quite that crystal clear before, when that most reliable Democrat vote is sold off to plantations to harvest votes to elect other Democrats in other places, after this referendum election, that dream deferred may be just like that old raisin in the sun, or maybe, as they say, if in my heart I do believe, we shall overcome someday.
This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest. This has been a Filmways presentation, darling.
And y'all come back now. Yeah.